Now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Obernolte.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Director Young. Congratulations on your confirmation. Thank you for the introductory phone call. It was very nice getting to know you. I'm certainly looking forward to working with you. So I'd like to continue a line of questioning that a number of the other members of the panel have raised about the assumptions that were made on the rate of inflation when the budget was created. So my understanding is that the rate of inflation that was assumed for this year is 4.7%. Obviously, we're trending towards nearly twice that. And for the rest of the budgetary forecast was 2.3%, which I think the Federal Reserve and most every economist would agree it's going to be substantially more than that. And you've explained that that was because the budget was crafted in November before the recent spike in inflation. Do I have all that right?
That's correct.
So I'm curious as to, because I'm hopeful, Mr. Chairman, as members of this panel on both sides of the aisle have testified, I'm hopeful that we can actually do what Congress is meant to do, take this budget and craft an actual budget proposal out of it and pass that budget. So we have to rely on the figures that you're giving us and try and craft our own budget out of that. What changes do you think the fact that the assumptions that you made about inflation when you crafted the budget were incorrect, what effect do you think that has on the numbers in the budget?
As I mentioned earlier, inflation has an offsetting mechanism. So typically with higher inflation, revenues are also higher. So we believe our debt and deficit targets remain about the same. I'd also point out it's a 10-year budget. Our long-term inflation numbers are still in line with private forecasters. And I point out the word forecasters. Just like the government forecast estimates, so do the private markets. And the long-term estimates are still in line with those private forecasters.
Okay, so the Department of Labor just recently came out with statistics showing that real wage growth is actually negative by about 2.5% right now. And the Congressional Budget Office says that actually is going to have, as inflation goes up, that has a negative effect on budgets, because although revenues go up, they don't go up enough to compensate for higher expenses, and as the interest rates rise, a greater percent of the budget has to be spent on debt service. So I mean, would you say that, given the fact that actual inflation is running about twice what the assumption was, would you say that the long-term deficit reduction is going to be the same?
It'll be about the same, but you're right. The more interest rates, not inflation, goes up. I was speaking to inflation on interest rates. You're right, that does have an impact on what you pay in debt service. We also look at what the historical rates are and what we pay on the debt based on historical averages. We're still in line. We're paying less than historical norms on debt service. And even with higher interest rates, by the way, Mr. Obernolte, our budget does account for. We account for interest rates growing in this budget.
Yeah, well, I think we all join you in hoping that the rate that we have to pay on our national debt does not go up substantially. But pessimistically, I'm not sure that that's going to be the case. So long term, I was very happy to see the president concentrating on deficit reduction. Certainly was not the case with his proposed budget last year. That's a concern that many of us on this panel have. One of the things that you touted in your opening statement about the budget is that it's going to reduce the deficit by over $1 trillion over the forecasting period. But I wanted to be clear, you're talking about cumulatively, because our deficit is about 1.3 trillion right now. So we're not going to reduce it from 1.3 to 0.3. We're going to reduce it by $1 trillion over that 10-year forecast period.
So there are two deficit numbers I talked about, and they're important to get right. We're on track, absent this budget, to reduce the deficit by $1.3 trillion year over year, the largest ever decline in 1 year. The budget policies represent, if Congress takes them up, we believe another $1 trillion in deficit reduction.
Total, over the 10-year period.
Correct.
So, I mean, $100 billion a year, not $1 trillion in a single year.
Right.
So we're still going to have a substantial deficit by the end of the forecast period.
But remember, we're also looking at bringing down the deficit $1.3 trillion in 1 year.
We're on the same team here. Well, let me ask you about that, actually, as kind of a final question here. As I said, I was very encouraged to see the president focusing on deficit reduction. As Director of the OMB, what's your long-term philosophy on that? Do you think that we need to get to a balanced budget, and if so, how do we do that?
Mr. Obernolte, I think, and a lot of economists think, the better measure to look at than to try to get to zero debt, because you know this, the most spending in this budget is our beneficiaries, to Social Security, to Medicare, and to ensure that we preserve those benefits for our elderly or those close to make sure they get those benefits. We believe the more appropriate thing to do is look at whether the debt level is crowding out the country's ability to make investments. We don't think we're at that point. There's not a specific number that makes sense. You can't just say 60 trillion gets to be too much or 40 or 50. It really is, it's dependent on the size of the economy. And we believe we can handle the debt service payments given that interest rates remain historically low, even if rising.
Well, on that, we might disagree, but I see my
Your
time has expired. I
Yep.
yield back. Thank you very much.
Yep.